Well, I think we've still got some folks arriving, but I'm going to go ahead and get started. Feel free, if you would like to go out into the sunshine and stand or take your chair back there. I think I'll project enough that you can hear, but if you're fine where you are, that just relax and enjoy. Thank you so much for being here. As Robert Duvall said in the Vietnam movie, I love the smell of wood smoke in the morning, or maybe that's not exactly what he said, but it's just great to be here on day two of the Lord Dunmore War presentation. And I certainly want to thank the Frontier Cultural Foundation for putting all this together. I don't know how they did it, but they fulfilled one of my dreams yesterday when there was a muster on the courthouse green, if you would, and then they marched out. I mean, that's exactly the way it was 250 years ago. It's just amazing to physically see it. I've heard about it, I've read about it, I've written about it, but there it was. It was so good to see. One word of warning, I come from a long line of ministers. Something happened to me, I fell off the wagon, did something wrong, so obviously I went a different direction, but still I get the shakes when it's 10 o'clock on a Sunday morning, so just be aware, just be aware. A little bit about me. So my family came into the valley in 1700s. The first ancestor here is buried in the Glebe Cemetery. He was a Revolutionary War guy and is buried with other heroes from the Revolutionary War in the cemetery about 15 minutes from here. They were German, so that's my descent. And I was always interested in the military, joined the militia, now the National Guard in 1970, and had a career that stretches me through a lot of different positions, almost all related to the home here in the Augusta Militia. So I would invite you to have questions anytime about the military and how it fits into this, because sometimes it's confusing. For example, you know, what's a division, what's a brigade, what is a regiment, and so forth and so on. And even I tend to get that confused from time to time. So if you have a question about anything here, feel free to ask as we go through. I don't want you to hold all the questions till the end in case we get late and I don't get a chance to answer them for you. So you're free to raise your hand and I'll try to stop. Give me a chance to have a sip of coffee too while we try to discuss something along the way. Was anyone here yesterday for Dr. Preston? Okay, so he gave the foreplay, if you would. He talked about Forbes' expedition and Braddock and so forth, and that's what happened up until the time we're going to talk about today. But I still think it's important to go back a little bit in time to talk about the Augusta Militia. First of all, let me talk about the road behind me, because as the truck traffic gets going, it's probably going to get a little rougher. But it was the warrior path that brought the Indians into the area. They hunted here. This was their hunting ground, even though they lived in Chillicothe, Ohio, and the plains out there in Ohio. Here's where they came to hunt. Can you imagine? Let's go out and hunt this afternoon. Think how long it took them to move those 300 and some miles here as their hunting ground. And the last thing they did was to burn it so that the underbrush would be open in the spring. Before it got green again, they could come and hunt. They didn't like the vegetation covering the ground. They didn't mind the trees, but the small vegetation. They actually burned through here. So this was the warrior path, I mean, right here where we're standing, where we're seated today. And that's just really neat to be here. Now, the thing you got to remember is later on it becomes the soldier's path, the settler's path, finally the Great Road. But if you live in this area or you use the road out here behind me, it's probably as dangerous today out there as it was back in the 1730s. You know? Anyway, it's interesting that road now in State 81, when you come into Virginia, it's named for John Lewis, who was the first settler that came here in the 1730s. And it comes to Stanton, and then a little bit south of here it becomes the Andrew Lewis Highway, because Andrew left here, moved to Roanoke, and then out to West Virginia, so forth. So you got the Interstate 81 is basically the Lewis Highway. So the 1730s, the first settlers come here. The settlements started in Winchester, worked their way down, and as I mentioned, John Lewis built his home, Bellefonte, very close to here. And this was the settlers' route. And who were those settlers? They were descendants, they were from Germany. They were from Scotch-Irish descent. They were French in some cases. But the one thing they had in common was most of them wanted to get the heck out of Europe. You know what I'm saying? They did not like it over there. They wanted religious freedom, they wanted land, they wanted freedom, so forth and so on. So they came here. Now, I want to make it clear up front, these were some bad dudes. I mean, these were not the English people on the other side of the mountain with their plantations and slaves and living the life. These guys were coming here. They knew they had to fight for this land, and they were prepared to do that, and they did time and time again, which we'll talk about. So the access was starting in Philadelphia, where they landed, most of them, came down through Lancaster, York, Harper's Ferry, Winchester, and then down the valley, or up the valley here. And up the valley, down the valley is important because the Shenandoah River kind of defines it, and it flows north. So when we think of going down the valley, we're actually going up the valley when we're coming from Winchester to Stanton. That's coming up the valley, not down the valley. I always say I'm going down the valley. No, I'm not. Anyway, it's confusing because of the river flow, but the valley actually descends from Stanton in that direction. But 283 years ago, just think about it. The settlers are here. There's Indians that are coming in from time to time and raiding settlements. There was concern. So in 1624, the government in Williamsburg had created a militia force and authorized militias. There was nothing like that here until 283 years ago, 3 November 1741, the Augusta Militia was formed. So what did that mean? It meant everybody from 18 to 60 was called to serve. Well, guess what? That's the only people that were here. We didn't have a lot of young people, and we didn't have a lot of old people, so just about everybody that came into Augusta County was compelled to be a part of the Augusta Militia. It was formed with 12 companies of 50 soldiers each, and it mustered as it did yesterday for the first time, again, 283 years ago. First commander was Colonel James Patton, and we'll talk more about him. But the most interesting thing, I think, to take away from this presentation is the Augusta Militia was responsible for everything from the Blue Ridge Mountains to my rear, all the way out to the Mississippi River and the Great Lakes. So that encompasses West Virginia, Kentucky, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, gets into the Rust Belt, Michigan, Wisconsin, and part of Pennsylvania, western Pennsylvania, because the Quakers, they liked Philadelphia and that land there. They had no interest in going out to Pittsburgh and stirring up any trouble with the French or the Indians out there. So we actually owned a big part of Pennsylvania. So just think about, honey, it's Sunday morning. I got to go to work this week. I need to run out to St. Louis, see how things are doing out there, and then slip over to Chicago, and then Minneapolis. I mean, can you imagine the responsibility these guys had on their shoulders when they mustered and said, holy cow, they didn't tell us that when we signed up, but that was their responsibility. Now, fortunately, the French had a similar idea that they owned those places, so therefore the Augusta Militia was never in a situation where they had to go out there. But it was part of their charter and something that they had to be concerned with and responsible for. The first combat from the Augusta Militia occurred at a little place called Balcony Falls, which is close to Buena Vista and Lexington. The Captain McDowell and Company Number 12 engaged a group of Indians there. McDowell was killed along with 7 of his men. And there's a cemetery just this side of Lexington, right on Route 11, that you can see where those soldiers were interred. But that was the first action of the 116th, the Augusta Militia, the regiment. The regiment then started gradually to get more and more engaged in the Indian Wars and the conflicts with the French. The British had no military in here. Boston was occupied by the British. We had nobody out here but us, okay? And the British governor and his flag telling us what to do. So when there was an issue with the French, for example, the governor would send parts of George Washington and parts of the Augusta Militia to places like Erie, Pennsylvania, to tell them to get out of town. And of course, they had something to say back, and Washington came back and said that didn't go well. So the governor said, well, take the Augusta Militia, go up there and kick them out of Fort Duquesne. That shouldn't be theirs. So he goes up there with that thought in mind. Didn't work out again, and in his retreat, he had to build a fortress called Fort Necessity, very close to where 9/11 Flight 93 crashed. And it's a neat little park. But Washington was not a tactician at the time. He wasn't really a military guy. He was a surveyor. So he built his fortress right in the middle of a field surrounded by woods. So that didn't go real well because they were actually like a target sitting out in the middle of the field, and they surrendered very quickly. The French were kind enough to let them march off and come back to Augusta County. But it's an interesting little negative side of our hero, George Washington. So he came back and he told the governor, we need to start building forts because we can't run the French out of there. They're going to start coming this way and bringing the Indians with them. So there was a line of forts in the Appalachian Allegheny Mountains behind you that Washington was responsible for constructing. So he was really integrated with the Augusta Militia here for some time. In 1754-5, the militia was mustered to go to Fort Duquesne. This was Braddock's adventure with Washington. Andrew Lewis was there, a lot of other heroes of the Augusta Militia in the valley. That didn't go well, as we talked about yesterday. In 1756, Colonel Patton, the brigade, the militia was deployed in different places. So he took a route to resupply them in different places. So he went down to a place called Ingalls Farm, and now that's called Blacksburg, and a little school there called Virginia Tech. But if you go to the west of that campus, you'll find the home of the Ingalls, who were there, and he was a captain in the militia. And Patton went there to deliver powder to him and to update his records. So the family goes out to the fields to work. Unbeknown to anybody, the Indians were very close by. They basically killed all the family that they didn't want to capture, broke into the cabin where the colonel was working. He heard them coming. He shot the first two coming through the door and engaged the third one that eventually killed him. So the brigade commander, the 1st Brigade commander, dies in basically Virginia Tech, Blacksburg area. The interesting part of that is here are all the records spread out on the table he was working on, and the family that came in to recover, clean up, whatever, saved them all, and they were passed by family to family until they actually today are in the University of Wisconsin in Madison. The original records are there, been there at the White Gloves, and it's unbelievable to see the initial muster rolls and everything are right there as they were 283 years ago. 1758, they had a little better success with Forbes getting to Fort Duquesne in Pittsburgh. And in 1764, right here in the valley was the last Indian raid. It occurred about 10 miles from here going west. And it was the Trimble and Crawford farms. They were all killed. And one of those family members' descendants was Secretary of the Army John Marsh, your congressman from this area, many of you may remember. The militia was called out. Captain Moffett, took the militia, chased down the Indians, took back the prisoners, killed the Indians, and came back. And that was really the last serious activity of Indians in this area. I need to back up one notch to say the raid in Blacksburg, the Ingalls, if you have ever heard of Mary Ingalls and the story of Follow the River, she was taken prisoner, taken up to the camps outside Chillicothe, escaped and brought back, came home to Ingalls Farm. Amazing story right there. So local historian of the time, Samuel Kercheval, Shenandoah Valley history author, says, during this time, after this last raid, peace and tranquility existed till 1774. The Indians had given up on making this their hunting ground. They basically withdrew over the mountains, and now the focus becomes on the Ohio River Valley. So it's 1774, and a number of incidents occur. The Ohio Valley, the river, was the key. Both the settlers and the Indians used it. Both of them had homes and camps on both sides of it, and that soon erupted into conflict, first of all on the water. Then the settlers would go and attack the Indian camps, and then the Indians would come attack the white camps, settlements. Not a big deal until Chief Logan, who was a Kawaya Indian chief, great guy apparently, if you ever read about him, nice gentleman. He said, I always welcome the settlers into my home, I treat them like family. Anyway, there were some settlers that decided to attack his home. He was not there, and all of his family's wife, children, 12 were killed. massacred by white settlers. So Logan comes home. He's probably not a very happy camper, and he does what, you know, probably most of us would do. He's going to get some payback. And so he goes over and has a massacre on the white settlement side, and so it's getting out of hand now. And the guy that's running out that worked out there that pretty much represented the governor was Michael Creasap, and he was a captain in the militia out there from here, but went out there to begin settlements. He notified the governor, it's out of control out here, you got to do something. So Lord Dunmore, who'd been the governor here in Virginia since 1771, decides he's got to mobilize the militia. And so what does that entail? What does that mean? So the militia that was involved in at this point in time were basically a northern force that he called a division, okay? And a division has at least 2 regiments, and he did. And he mobilized a southern division. This is the one we're familiar with here, Andrew Lewis, and the Augusta Militia. But it wasn't just the Augusta Militia. In the north, he had the Berkeley Militia, the Hampshire County Militia, and the Frederick Militia. He had units from Culpeper, Fredericksburg, and so forth, also involved in that movement. In the south here, he had, of course, the Augusta Militia. He had Bedford, he had Fincastle, he had some of the elements from Culpeper here. Anyway, it was a major effort to get those 2 divisions together. Both of them totaled about 1,000, roughly 1,000. And now, so they're mustering here to get going, as you saw yesterday. Just picture having to get 150 roughly pack horses to get the supplies out there, 200, 300 head of cattle to feed them as they went, as they begin to march the 200 and some miles to what becomes known as Point Pleasant. So this group right here goes to what's now Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. They called it Camp Union, and all the regiments converged there. The Botetourt, the Fincastle, all of them met right there. And that's where Andrew Lewis took charge of the Southern Regiment. The Northern Regiment went up the James, wound up circling around, had their major camp at Fort Pitt or Fort Duquesne. Now he called it Fort Dunmore, interestingly enough. And they were located there, and the 2, I was trying to get a whiteboard, but basically here they are converging, if you would, towards the Indian camps out in Ohio. Indians, of course, are obviously aware of it, and here's where it gets interesting, is the discussion that exists on treachery in this whole game. The treachery was that the white militiamen that were with the governor would later say that the Indians came there and met with Dunmore on October the 5th. And they left there and headed south. And they believed, there was a belief that the Indians, that Dunmore had wanted the Indians to lead an attack at Point Pleasant and destroy the militia there, the other division, and then he'd be the man. You know what I'm saying? Here's my guys, we went ahead, we won, the militia got run off, but my guys, and so forth and so on. He, you know, there's a lot of question of treachery from the British government, if you would, and how he interacted with the militia of the Southern Division. So the Southern Division gets up to Point Pleasant and sets up a camp right on the confluence of the Kanawha and Ohio River. Great, beautiful sight. And they're there on October 6th. They left Camp Union on the 11th of September, another 9/11, and almost 30 days later they wound up at the camp at Point Pleasant. They established their camp, the cattle catch up, they built rafts in Charleston to get some of the supplies up. So they're basically settling and waiting to hear from the governor. Governor never gets to them. They don't know what's to do. So they're sitting there, and on the morning of the 10th of October, they're getting low on food, and one of the colonels was sick, and his men said, well, let's go kill a turkey and have him turkey soup for him this morning. But in the early morning hours, what the camp did not know was over 1,000 Indians had come out of their camps in the Piccadilly Plains, crossed the Ohio in roughly 125 canoes, and positioned themselves in line to attack the Southern Division. So the first action occurs when 2 guys, Mooney and Hughes, they're going out hunting for deer. These guys were looking for venison. They run into the Indians, run smack into them. So they didn't know what to do. So right off the bat, Mooney's killed by the Indians firing on him. The other gentleman takes off running. Good idea. Gets back to the camp, says, hey, the Indians are coming. There's suspicion at first, but then another hunting party came back and said, oh, yeah, we just saw them. They're coming this way. So Andrew Lewis gets up, lights his pipe, starts to think about it here, and now he sees it. He can feel it. And so he orders his brother Charles, who's in command of the Augusta Militia that was mustered here yesterday. He says, Charles, take your division, your regiment forward. And this Fincastle regiment is getting ready to follow you, okay? Charles Lewis was so proud of being in the British Army in the Forbes expedition and other times. He still had his red scarlet coat. And he put that coat on, buttoned it up, grabbed his rifle, goes running out in head of his men. Well, you talk about a target of opportunity. If you're an Indian and you see one guy in a red outfit and everybody else in soldier togs, you know, so he was shot almost instantly. He was picked up by his men, taken back to his tent, laid in his cot where he later died. The musket supposedly that he was carrying that day, and I say that because there's no paper trail to back it up, but that weapon was given to the 29th Division Museum in Verona, which we'll talk about later. It was given to us and is in the visitor center up there on display. If you'd like to see the musket that was supposed to be carried by Charles Lewis the morning he was killed, October the 10th. So now you've got the Indians advancing. The militia is all in now. So you've basically got 1,000 Indians confronting 1,000 of the militia. Both of them heavily armed. It's not bow and arrows. We're talking about muskets. You know, we're talking about hatchets. We're talking about tomahawks. It is a real fight, hand to hand. It goes on for over 4 hours. Neither side wants to give an inch. And here comes the name Stonewall that was given to the Augusta Militia way back 1774. They didn't move. They wouldn't back off. The Indians wouldn't back off. Suddenly, and I think it was not a plan at all of Lewis's, not that he wasn't a good general officer or statistician, but strategy guy, but he said he had no responsibility for that. But 3 companies of the militia decided, well, let's go around here to the right and see if we can get behind the Indians. Now, as soon as they made that move to the right, along Crooked Creek is the place out there, then the Indians began to recognize there was an enemy over here, let's get out of here. So Cornstalk, the chief that was running the whole expedition, said, let's get out of here. It's interesting, the Indians left nothing behind. There were no weapons. There were none of their casualties. Those that were killed, and there were many of them, were just tossed into the Ohio River. And they got on about 50 canoes and scooted out back across the river before dark that evening. The next morning, the militia, going to follow their trail, found 78 canoes still on the banks, on the eastern banks of the Ohio River. So when they departed, that would tell you that a lot of Indians were killed. They didn't need their canoes going back, okay? But on the other side of the exchange, 15% of the militia force there under Andrew Lewis became a casualty. 15%. There are 51 killed and 87 of them wounded. So now it's the morning of the 11th. Lewis has got a mess on his hands. He's got wounded soldiers. Here's his brother lying dead. Here's his son severely wounded. And he's still waiting on the governor to tell him what to do. There was again back in Dunmore's camp word that the Indians had come from Point Pleasant and told Dunmore what had happened, and they said, we're going back to Chillicothe, and he pulls his force together, the Northern Division, and he crosses the Ohio River and starts towards the Indian camps. Finally, on the 17th of October, Lewis decides it's time for him to move. He's gotten word of some movement of Dunmore's division, so he crosses the Ohio River, with the force that he can muster. Obviously the dead have been buried, the wounded are there being cared for in a little fortress he made to protect them. So he goes across the Ohio, and again, he can't be a happy camper. He thinks about his brother, he thinks about his son, he thinks about all the people laying there that he had to bury in the days previous. So he's not happy as he comes across Indians and Indian encampments. I mean, he destroys them going towards the major Indian camp in the Piccadilly Plains. So he's converging this way. Dunmore's coming in this way. Dunmore gets there way earlier, and he sends word to the Indians, let's talk about this. Cornstalk comes out. They say, oh yeah, we don't need to do this anymore. Let's just have a peace. Dunmore's going to be a hero. He ends the Indian struggle out there through a peaceful means. So here comes Lewis. Again, he's not a happy camper. Governor sends Ryder down, says, stop where you are, go back, I got this. No, Lewis says, I don't think so. Just keeps moving. Later on, second rider comes. You've got to stop. Governor demands you stop right here. Lewis says, I don't think so. Lewis continues to go until Dunmore gets on a horse with his security team, comes down and says, you've got to stop. Lewis says, I don't think so. Anyway, this is where Daniel Morgan and a lot of the guys that Andrew Lewis knew from previous engagements like Braddock and Forbes' campaign, they're with Dunmore. Take Lewis aside and said, hey, you can't do this. You got to stop here. We're having a conflict with the British, the Crown here. You cannot. This is a place you've got to stop. So after that discussion, he relents, and there'll be a neat follow-on with what Morgan and them got to thinking afterwards. But anyway, Lewis relents. The Southern Division withdraws. Dunmore stays. He concludes a peace with Cornstalk and the Indians. Basically gives the rights to the Ohio Valley to the settlers. The Ohio River Valley is theirs, and mainly that includes Kentucky. The whole state of Kentucky is now an area that can be settled. The river, of course, is owned by the settlers also. It's called the Treaty of Charlotte, named for the king's wife, Charlotte. And then Dunmore withdraws his division. They go back to Fort Gower, which was their mustering place. It's about 100 miles from Chillicothe, but only 40 miles from where Lewis and the Southern Division was when they were on the Ohio River. So why communications weren't better by canoe, by boat, by whatever, it's still a question why they didn't have better communications between those two divisions prior to and following the Battle of Point Pleasant. Well, when they get back to Gower, the militia says, let's take a rest here before we go back down to our homes. And they started thinking, and they said, wait a minute, maybe Lewis had this right, maybe, we're being taken advantage of, and we need to make a statement here that we're uncomfortable with this, I guess is the best way to put it. So they wrote what was called the Fort Gower Resolves. And basically they were saying, we love the mother country, so forth and so on, but understand don't tread on me. You know what I'm saying? Do not mess with us, but so much. And that was the guys that were with Dunmore wrote that. Fascinating story. Then this idea spread pretty quickly. So the Southern Division comes back, and right off the bat, the Fincastle organization gets together, and they come out with the Fincastle reserves on the 20th, resolves on the 20th of January, saying, hey, okay, England, we like you, but just be careful here. You're on a thin ice. Then on February the 22nd, Augusta County came out with resolves. Fairfax County, all kinds of counties that were learned about what happened at Point Pleasant and the conduct of the governor started coming out making statements. These got to England, and Parliament reviewed them and they're furious. Who do these upstarts think they are? They don't know who they're messing with here. Well, it's an interesting story of how those resolves all started with the Battle of Point Pleasant. And then to continue to track time, on March the 23rd, Patrick Henry gave his "Give me liberty, give me death" speech. Now that one resounded, you better believe, to a point where the governor got a little concerned about all this. And in this same time period, he seizes the powder magazine in Williamsburg, gets on a boat in the James River and says, I feel a lot more safe out here than I do in Williamsburg right now, because Williamsburg was starting to rumble, the Continental Congress and so forth, and the Virginia Assembly, the Continental Congress, so forth, is rolling. So the Virginia militia is mobilized now in this area, and since there is none down there, it is Andrew Lewis and the Augusta Militia and other militias that will go over the mountains, go through Richmond down to Williamsburg, and eventually force the governor to go further down the river, down to what's basically the Norfolk, Chesapeake area. And on Gwynn's Island, on April the 18th, this is the following year, 1776, the governor is defeated, his force is defeated, the ships are driven off, and they burn Norfolk, and then they're gone. Those are the royal presence in Virginia ends with the governor's departure. But backing up, April of 1775 on the 18th was Battle of Concord and Lexington. You know, that's, as we say, the shot heard fired around the world. Bunker Hill followed on June 1775, and with that, the militia is active everywhere. The ones here had their militiamen from Augusta that joined those from Winchester, and they did what was called the Beeline March, and that's where they met George Washington and said, hey, we're with you. You got your militia with you. Now form your army and let's get this done. So it's quite a story, and again, so much of it does track back to the Battle of Point Pleasant. So a lot of historians at the time especially call this that was the first battle of the Revolution. So whether it was the first battle or it was the match that would eventually hit the powder has been disputed for a long time. But the 60th Congress of the United States, February 17, 1908, declared it in writing that this was the first battle of the American Revolution. Now, some great authors, like you'll hear this afternoon, Dr. Glenn Williams, will question that a little bit, and on good sound judgment. And that's a great story he's going to tell this afternoon. And he's written a great book on Dunmore's War that if you haven't read it, you need to. But no matter what, the revolution follows. And so what happens to the Augusta militia? So they're still challenged to maintain security to the west. So we had militia units constantly responding to Indian raids along as far out as the Ohio. You've got to remember that the British immediately basically won over the Indians with funds and support. So they got the Indians to keep it very active out to the west in fighting against us. So we had militia that were still soldiers here protecting the valley and the Ohio River region. We also had militia that joined Washington. So on the settling of the war in Yorktown, there were 8 companies of basically the Augusta militia here that were present at the Battle of Yorktown. How they got there is another neat story to talk about sometime, but they responded to Tarleton trying to come over the mountains. So all the fighting men in this area responded, and then from that point they chased Tarleton and Cornwallis all the way to Yorktown. So the bad people that I've been talking about, I want to say to you, have been there ever since they came here, and they're here today. And I say that to you because they were the Stonewall Brigade in the Civil War. They were the 116th Regiment in the Meuse-Argonne campaign, October the 8th, 1918. Within 30 days after they're getting involved in the Meuse-Argonne campaign, the war ended on August the 11/11. So they were key there. And if you really want to remember these guys right here, and I'm talking about from Stanton, Augusta County, Waynesboro, you think about D-Day, when they were given the task of attacking Omaha Beach, landing on Omaha Beach, the most difficult landing of D-Day. I'll argue that one with anybody who wants to go there with me. Having been there many times and looked at the other beaches and studied the way they were conducting business, the Army was in. These guys were given a tough fight, and again, they came through. They were there on 9/11 with me in airports. A lot of stories to come out of that. deeply involved in the global war on terrorism, Afghanistan, Iraq. January the 6th, what happened in D.C., if we talk about that, who did the government send into the Capitol building? It was the Stonewall Brigade. It was the guys from the old Augusta Militia that entered the Capitol. Great stories from that too. They said it's the best duty they ever had, because every time a congressman would go by, he'd say, "How you doing?" "Oh, I wish I had something to eat. I wish I had something to drink." And aides would come running, bringing them all kinds of stuff. This is absolutely the best duty they ever had. Nancy Pelosi got involved, put them in the best hotels. They each had private rooms in the Hyatt and Regency hotels up there around the Capitol. And they served there for 30 days, got through the inauguration and everything peacefully. But again, amazing, the tip of the spear. You need somebody out there quick and ready to fight. It was the Stonewall Brigade that they put into the Capitol. Today they're engaged heavily with NATO. They're called the 116th IBCT Infantry Combat Brigade Team. They've been to Ukraine, elements of them. There are elements of them right now in Finland, right on the border with Russia, and tell great stories about how tough the Finns are. And if the Russians got a brain in their head, they aren't going to ever come mess with them there, because the Finns are tough fighters. So the Augusta Militia, in closing, is still out there. It's a fighting spirit. The Army recognizes it. It's always put whether it was Robert E. Lee or the generals in conflict since, the Stonewall Brigade has always been the one at the lead. They became the 116th Infantry Regiment during World War I, and that's when they became part of the 29th Infantry Division. So I'll snip off that patch right there, which is our regimental, and it says "Ever Forward," because that's our motto. And I'll snip on this one because this is our 29th Division patch, the blue and gray that was on Omaha Beach, and that's who we continue to serve with today. At least I said I'd put it on there. Maybe I won't. Maybe I'll just think about it. So in closing, let me talk a little bit about what's going on with the Augusta Militia locally today. We formed an organization called the Citizen Soldier Education Foundation. So we're applying for grants, and we got a number of projects going on that I think you'd be interested in. One is we got a historic log cabin that had been at Valley Forge for over 100 years. It's now in connexes in our property in Verona. This week, I hope, if not this week, next week, they're going to start opening those connexes and restoring that cabin. We put down a concrete pad that it can be built on. We have a restoration company coming out of Pennsylvania to reconstruct it. So it will be a World War I cabin as well as a Revolutionary Frontier era cabin. So a lot going on with that. We have a trip leaving shortly to go to France. We do trips to World War I and World War II to keep people involved in what we did over there. A week from today, or a week from Friday, will be the opening of the Pershing Memorial Park World War I exhibit in Washington, about 2 blocks from the White House. And we'll be there with a display representing our World War I history. October 9th, we're going to be going to Point Pleasant. We're leaving from our museum, going across the roads, the routes that the militia took, spending the night in Charleston at the Marriott there. It's a $395 package. It includes the transportation and the room. We get to Point Pleasant that morning of the 10th. The main ceremony starts at 10 o'clock, and that's when Governor Youngkin and a number of congressmen, is going to be a big event. Again, 250th anniversary of Point Pleasant is like a month away. Tremendous opportunity. So we do a lot. We appreciate the support of our local citizens. We appreciate the support of those who have traveled here because you came down Interstate 81 probably, and that deserves something for sure. But we're at exit 227 if anybody wants to drive by and see. Our collection goes back to 1741 and comes up through the latest deployments that the organization's been involved with in Afghanistan. So I'm happy to answer any questions that you have, and I do hope you have some, because that's the best part of this for me, is to see what I didn't make clear enough, and that's probably most everything I said. So.